Your little experiment is worthless, my wife's dad, the boss, declared at a meeting. As he signed the papers, my phone buzzed. Quantum Tech patent approved. Bidding starts at $3.7 billion. I smiled. About that signature. So there I was, sitting at this ridiculously long mahogany table that probably cost more than most people's cars, trying not to let my sweaty palms leave marks on the polished surface. The whole setup screamed, Corporate Intimidation 101. You know, the kind of boardroom where dreams go to die and middle managers practice their soul-crushing speeches. My laptop sat open beside me like a faithful sidekick, filled with months of research that apparently nobody gave two shits about, and my carefully organized notes that I'd spent half the night perfecting, because, hey, I'm nothing if not prepared for my own execution. Henry Aldrich, my dear father-in-law and the CEO of Aldrich Dynamics, sat at the head of the table like some kind of corporate king, twirling his stupid Mont Blanc fountain pen with all the theatrical flair of a wannabe Shakespeare villain. God, I hated that pen. He'd bought it for $3,000 just to sign documents that ruined people's lives, and he treated it like Excalibur or some shit. The man had this whole routine down to a science. The dramatic pause, the condescending stare, the way he'd lean back in his leather throne and survey the room like he owned everyone's souls. Which, to be fair, he pretty much did. The boardroom was packed tighter than a subway car during rush hour. Directors in their identical gray suits sat around the table like a jury of corporate zombies, their faces showing about as much emotion as a dead fish. Henry's personal assistants hovered nearby, probably calculating how many zeros would be in their Christmas bonuses for witnessing this public humiliation. And then there was Claire, my loving wife, sitting there with that smug little smile plastered across her face like she'd just won the lottery. Her diamond earrings caught the fluorescent lights every time she moved her head, sending little sparkles dancing across the wall like a disco ball at a funeral. Those earrings, by the way, cost more than my entire lab setup. I knew because I'd bought them for our anniversary last year, back when I still thought she gave a damn about me or my work. Now they just served as a constant reminder of how naive I'd been, thinking that maybe, just maybe, the woman I married might actually support her husband's career instead of actively sabotaging it. Your little experiment is worthless, Henry declared, his voice booming across the room with all the subtlety of a freight train hitting a brick wall. He slid a stack of transfer documents across the table toward me, and I swear the papers made this ominous sliding sound, like the whisper of death itself. We're cutting our losses before this embarrassment costs us any more money. Claire's smirk widened, and I could practically hear her internal victory dance. She'd been waiting for this moment, like a vulture circling roadkill. Hell, she'd probably been planning it since the day I first pitched my quantum stability algorithm to the board 6 months ago. I remembered that day clearly, how she'd sat in the back of the room, filing her nails and rolling her eyes every time I got excited about a breakthrough. Real supportive wife material right there. Global Tech is offering $2 million, Henry continued, his tone suggesting he was doing me the favor of a lifetime. Which, frankly, is more than this nonsense deserves. You should be grateful someone's willing to pay anything for your. He paused, searching for the perfect insult, science fiction fantasies. 2 million. The man said it like he was announcing the cure for cancer. Meanwhile, the other directors nodded along like bobbleheads in a hurricane, probably relieved they wouldn't have to pretend to understand quantum physics anymore. I'd seen this routine before. Henry would make his dramatic pronouncement. Everyone would agree because disagreeing meant career suicide, and then they'd all go back to their offices to gossip about the crazy son-in-law who thought he was the next Einstein. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Once, then twice. I tried to ignore it because, you know, basic meeting etiquette and all that, but the damn thing kept going off like a car alarm. Buzz, buzz, buzz. Claire shot me a look that could have melted steel, probably thinking I was getting calls from creditors or something equally embarrassing. Henry's eye twitched. The man hated interruptions almost as much as he hated admitting he was wrong about anything. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Sorry, let me just. I pulled out my phone, expecting to see some spam about extending my car warranty, or maybe my mom asking if I'd eaten lunch. Instead, I saw a message from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. My heart damn near stopped beating. Patent approved. Breakthrough status. Initial bidding starts at $3.7 billion. I read it again. Then a third time. Billion. With a B. Not million. Billion. As in, enough money to buy a small country or fund NASA for a few years. I almost started laughing right there in the middle of Henry's big dramatic moment. The timing was so perfect it felt like divine intervention, like the universe had decided to play the ultimate practical joke on my asshole in-laws. I looked up at Henry, who was still holding his precious pen, having just signed his name to those transfer documents with a flourish that would have made John Hancock jealous. The man was practically glowing with self-satisfaction, probably already planning how he'd spin this story at the country club. Cleaned house today, he'd tell his golf buddies. Got rid of some dead weight. About that signature, I said calmly, sliding my phone across the polished table toward him. The device made this satisfying little skidding sound as it came to rest right in front of his shocked face. The silence that followed was absolutely golden. You could have heard a pin drop in that boardroom, if pins made sounds when they hit imported Italian marble floors. Henry's face went through about 17 different shades of confusion as he read the message, his eyes getting wider with each word. Claire leaned forward, squinting at the screen like she was trying to decode hieroglyphics. What? Henry started, but his voice cracked like a teenage boy asking someone to prom. 3.7 billion, I repeated, savoring each syllable like fine wine. Not million, Henry. Billion. With a B. You know, the number that comes after million? The one with 9 zeros instead of 6. And that, folks, was the moment Henry Aldrich realized he'd just signed away his company's claim to the biggest technological breakthrough of the century. His hand started shaking so hard that precious Montblanc pen of his clattered onto the table like a dead bug. The room went dead silent, and I mean cemetery at midnight silent. You could have heard a mouse fart in that boardroom. Claire's smug-ass smile didn't just disappear. It completely imploded, like a demolished building collapsing in on itself in slow motion. Her jaw dropped so far I was genuinely concerned she might dislocate something. And those expensive diamond earrings of hers stopped sparkling because she'd gone completely statue still. Henry's hand was shaking around that pretentious Montblanc pen like he was having some kind of corporate seizure, and his face had gone from its usual pompous red to a sickly shade of green that reminded me of expired milk. The directors around the table leaned forward like a pack of hungry wolves who'd just caught the scent of fresh meat. Their dead fish expressions had suddenly come alive with dollar signs practically glowing in their eyeballs. I could practically hear their brains doing the math. 3.7 billion split however many ways, minus taxes, plus bonuses, carry the one. These people could smell money from 3 states away, and right now the boardroom reeked of it. Not million, I said softly, letting the word hang in the air like a bad smell. Billion. I drew out that beautiful B word like I was savoring a perfectly aged whiskey. God, it felt good. I'd been waiting months to drop this bomb, and the explosion was even more spectacular than I'd imagined. Claire made this weird, choking sound, like she was trying to swallow her own tongue. She'd been mid-sip on her glass of wine, some overpriced French shit that probably cost more than most people make in a week. And now she was coughing and sputtering like she'd just inhaled liquid fire. Red wine splashed across her pristine white blouse, and I had to bite my lip to keep from grinning. That blouse probably cost $1,000, and now it looked like she'd been in a bar fight. That's impossible, Henry stammered, finally finding his voice. The great Henry Aldrich, CEO extraordinaire, master of the universe, sounding like a confused kindergartner who'd just learned that Santa Claus wasn't real. You can't. We own, the company funded. See? That's where you're wrong, Hank, I said, using the nickname I knew he absolutely despised. The man's eye twitched like he'd been electrocuted. Let me break this down for you in terms even a CEO can understand. I leaned back in my chair, enjoying the moment. This was better than Christmas morning, better than winning the lottery, better than finding out your ex got fat and bald and works at a gas station. This was pure, undiluted justice served ice cold with a side of fuck you. The patent for my quantum stability algorithm, I began, speaking slowly like I was explaining quantum physics to a golden retriever, was registered under my name. My personal name. Not Aldrich Dynamics. Not the company. Me. David fucking Thompson. I rarely swore in professional settings, but this felt like the right time to make an exception. But the funding, Claire started, her voice cracking like thin ice. Ah yes, the funding, I interrupted, holding up one finger like a professor about to deliver a lecture. Every single cent that went into this project came from my grandmother's trust fund. You remember Grammy Thompson, right, Claire? The sweet old lady you said was charmingly quaint and probably senile? Well, turns out her quaint little nest egg was worth about $12 million, and she left every penny of it to me. Claire's face went white as fresh snow. She remembered those comments, all right. She'd made them at Grammy's funeral, thinking the old woman was just some broke retiree with a house full of cats and doilies. Turned out Grammy had been quietly investing in tech stocks since the 1960s and never mentioned her portfolio to anyone except her lawyer. I kept meticulous records, I continued, pulling a thick manila folder from my briefcase. Every receipt, every invoice, every payment. My lawyer's been documenting everything for the past 18 months. Not one red cent of Aldrich Dynamics money touched this project. Not for equipment, not for materials, not for the lab space I rented across town, not even for the coffee I drank while working on it. Henry's mouth was opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The transfer documents he'd been so proud to sign suddenly looked like what they were, worthless pieces of paper signed by a man who had no legal right to transfer something he didn't own. You can't do this, Claire whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. She knew I could. Hell, she was probably already calculating how much alimony she'd lose in the divorce that was definitely coming after this shit show. Actually, I can, I said cheerfully. In fact, I already did. See, while you were busy planning my professional funeral, I was busy making sure every I was dotted and every T was crossed. My intellectual property, my funding, my patent. The holy trinity of go fuck yourself, Henry. My phone buzzed again, and I glanced down with theatrical casualness. Another message from the patent office. Google Incorporated raising initial bid to $4.0 billion. Microsoft submitting competing offer. Apple requesting private meeting. The directors around the table made this collective gasping sound, like a choir of asthmatics having simultaneous attacks. For billion. With AB. These people were looking at numbers so big they probably needed calculators just to count the zeros. For billion now, I announced casually, like I was discussing the weather. Funny how competition works, isn't it? Supply and demand, basic economics. Though I guess they don't teach that in MBA programs anymore. Henry finally found enough of his voice to croak out. This is betrayal. Your family. Family. I laughed, and it wasn't a nice laugh. It was the kind of laugh that could cut glass and make small children cry. Henry, you've treated me like something you scraped off your shoe since the day I married your daughter. You've undermined my work, dismissed my ideas, and made it clear that you thought Claire married beneath her station. And Claire. I turned to look at my dear wife, who was still dabbing wine stains from her ruined blouse. Well, Claire's made it pretty obvious that she's been waiting for an excuse to trade up to someone with a bigger bank account. The truth hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Everyone in that room knew exactly how the Aldrich family had treated me. The snide comments at dinner parties, the eye rolls during presentations, the way they'd introduce me as Claire's husband, instead of using my name, like I was some kind of accessory. My phone buzzed a third time. Amazon was now in the bidding war. For $0.5 billion and climbing. I stood up slowly, gathering my notes and closing my laptop. The transfer documents that Henry had signed with such theatrical flair were still sitting on the table, but now they looked like what they'd always been, garbage. Legal toilet paper signed by a man who'd just discovered he'd been playing checkers while I was playing chess. Gentlemen, I said to the shell-shocked board members, ladies, it's been enlightening. I'll be in touch through my attorney regarding the transition of ownership. Oh, and Henry. I paused at the door, savoring this final moment. You might want to update your LinkedIn profile. I hear the job market's pretty competitive these days. And with that, I walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind a table full of people whose entire world had just been turned upside down by the quiet, underestimated son-in-law they'd never bothered to take seriously. By 7:30 the next morning, the board of Aldrich Dynamics had convened what they were calling an emergency session, which was corporate speak for holy shit. We're fucked and need to figure out how to unfuck ourselves before the market opens. I'd barely gotten 3 hours of sleep, not because I was stressed, but because I kept waking up with this stupid grin on my face, replaying yesterday's boardroom massacre in my head like highlights from the Super Bowl. Henry was already planted in his usual spot at the head of the table when I walked in, looking like he'd aged about 10 years overnight. His perfectly styled silver hair was disheveled, his expensive suit was wrinkled, and he had these dark circles under his eyes that made him look like a raccoon who'd been hit by a garbage truck. The man was clearly running on pure rage and espresso at this point. His face was still that lovely shade of red that suggested his blood pressure was somewhere in the stroke risk zone. And Claire was perched next to him like some kind of designer vulture, whispering poison in his ear. The sight of them huddled together, probably plotting my demise, should have made me nervous. Instead, it just made me want to laugh. These people still thought they were playing the same game we'd been playing yesterday, not realizing that the rules had completely changed and I was now the one holding all the cards. I strolled into that boardroom like I owned the place, which, as it turned out, I basically did, but we'll get to that juicy little detail in a minute. Right behind me came Marcus Hale, my attorney, carrying what looked like enough legal documentation to choke a horse. Marcus was one of those lawyers who looked like he could argue with God and win, the kind of guy who wore $1,000 suits and charged by the minute for breathing in your general direction. But he was worth every penny, especially for moments like this. "Good morning, everyone," I said cheerfully, taking my usual seat at the table like nothing had changed. "Beautiful day, isn't it? I love the smell of corporate desperation in the morning." Henry's eye twitched. Claire looked like she was sucking on a lemon that had been marinating in vinegar. The other board members sat around the table looking like they'd all been collectively kicked in the nuts by life itself. Marcus, bless his cold legal heart, didn't waste any time with pleasantries. He opened his briefcase and started distributing thick legal binders to each person around the table, moving with the efficiency of a man who'd done this dance 1,000 times before. Each binder hit the polished wood with a satisfying thunk, and I watched the directors' faces go pale as they realized just how much paperwork was about to ruin their day. Inside those binders, Marcus announced in his courtroom voice, "You'll find documented proof of Mr. Thompson's patents, complete records of his independent funding sources, and most importantly, a clause that was embedded in Aldridge Dynamics' corporate charter. Specifically, Clause 47, Paragraph 3. The room went quiet except for the sound of pages rustling as everyone scrambled to find the relevant section. I leaned back in my chair, savoring the moment like fine wine. This was the part I'd been looking forward to since I'd first discovered that little legal landmine buried in the company's founding documents. Clause 47, Paragraph 3. Marcus continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who could quote legal precedents in his sleep, states that in any attempt to misappropriate intellectual property created by an employee or contractor, majority voting shares would automatically transfer to the creator of said property. This clause was written into the charter by Henry Aldridge himself, ironically, to protect the company from employees stealing ideas. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Henry had basically set up his own corporate death trap 20 years ago, probably never imagining that it would one day be used against him by his own son-in-law. I could see the exact moment the realization hit him. His face went from red to white to green in about 3 seconds flat. "That's impossible," Claire shrieked, her voice hitting a pitch that probably shattered windows in nearby buildings. "This is manipulation. This is fraud. This is legal," Marcus interrupted smoothly. "Completely and utterly legal. The moment your father signed those transfer documents yesterday, attempting to give away intellectual property that didn't belong to the company, he triggered Clause 47, Paragraph 3. Congratulations, Mr. Thompson. You now own controlling interest in Aldridge Dynamics." The silence that followed was absolutely beautiful. I'm talking about the kind of silence that comes right before a nuclear explosion, the moment when everyone realizes that their entire world is about to change forever. Henry's mouth was hanging open, so wide I was worried he might catch flies, and Claire looked like she was having some kind of breakdown. But wait, folks, it gets better. "There's more," I said, pulling out my tablet with the theatrical flair of a magician revealing his final trick. "See, I've been documenting some interesting behavior patterns for the past year. Amazing what people will do when they think nobody's watching." I started clicking through a slideshow that I'd been putting together for months. Security footage, recorded conversations, email screenshots. I'd been collecting evidence like a detective on steroids. The first slide showed Claire entering the office at midnight 3 months ago, using her executive access to break into the R&D files. Turns out, while Henry was busy dismissing my work as a science fiction, his darling daughter was stealing research data and selling it to competitors. I announced casually. Funny how that works, isn't it? Claire's face went from white to green. You were spying on me? Sweetie, I wasn't spying, I said with mock sympathy. I was protecting my intellectual property. There's a difference. See, when your husband starts acting like James Bond, it's usually because his wife is acting like Benedict Arnold. The next slide showed Claire meeting with executives from 3 different tech companies, passing along stolen research in exchange for what looked like briefcases full of cash. The slide after that showed her forging my signature on documents, trying to transfer patent applications to shell companies she'd set up. For the past year, I continued, I've been attending board meetings disguised as janitors, coffee servers, and maintenance staff. Turns out when you dress like the help, rich people literally don't see you. It's like having an invisibility cloak made of minimum wage. I clicked to another slide showing myself in a janitor's uniform, emptying trash cans right behind Henry as he discussed plans to get rid of the dead weight with other executives. Another slide showed me in a barista outfit, serving coffee while Claire bragged to her friends about how she was going to upgrade to a richer husband once my project failed. You people never even noticed me, I said, shaking my head in amazement. I was right there, listening to every conversation, recording every betrayal, documenting every illegal activity. And you treated me like furniture. Henry finally found his voice. This is entrapment. This is illegal surveillance. Actually, it's not. Marcus interjected with the satisfaction of a man who lived for moments like this. All recordings were made in public spaces or company property where there's no reasonable expectation of privacy. Everything here is completely admissible in court. The board members were looking around the table like they were trying to figure out which lifeboat to jump into first. These people could smell a sinking ship from miles away, and right now the SS Aldridge was taking on water fast. My phone buzzed. Another message from the patent office. The bidding war was now up to $6 billion and climbing. Tech giants were literally throwing money at each other trying to get their hands on my algorithm. So here's how this is going to work, I announced, standing up and straightening my tie. Henry, you're going to clean out your office. Claire, you're going to pack your shit and find somewhere else to live. And the rest of you are going to learn what it means to work for someone who actually gives a damn about innovation instead of just padding the quarterly reports. I looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. Welcome to the new Aldridge Dynamics, folks. Try not to fuck it up. I wasn't done yet. Not even close. While everyone was still processing the bombshell that I now owned their asses, I had one more present to unwrap for this delightful little family gathering. The best part about revenge isn't the initial strike. It's watching your enemies realize just how deep the rabbit hole goes, how thoroughly they've been outplayed, and how spectacularly they've underestimated the quiet guy they've been shitting on for years. Oh, Claire, I said sweetly, clicking to the next slide with all the enthusiasm of a kid on Christmas morning. We haven't even gotten to the good part yet. My darling wife was sitting there looking like she'd been hit by a freight train full of karma, her face cycling through about 12 different shades of panic. Her perfectly manicured hands were shaking as she gripped the edge of the table, and I could practically hear her brain short-circuiting as she tried to figure out how much legal trouble she was in. Spoiler alert, it was a lot. The new slide filled the conference room's massive wall-mounted screen with a detailed timeline that would have made the FBI jealous. Names, dates, dollar amounts, and photographs, all meticulously organized like a serial killer's murder board. Except instead of tracking victims, I'd been tracking corporate espionage and patent theft. Ladies and gentlemen, I announced like a game show host revealing the grand prize. I present to you the complete record of Claire Aldridge Thompson's greatest hits. And by hits, I mean the careers she destroyed, the researchers she sabotaged, and the innovations she buried to protect her own mediocre ass. The first name on the list was Dr. Sarah Chun, a brilliant materials scientist who'd been working on revolutionary battery technology 3 years ago. Claire had gotten her fired by planting evidence that she was selling trade secrets to Chinese competitors. The truth, which I'd uncovered through some creative investigative work, was that Claire had been the one selling secrets, and she'd framed Sarah to cover her tracks. Sarah Chun, I said, letting the name hang in the air like an accusation. Ring any bells, sweetheart? Brilliant woman, groundbreaking research, mysteriously fired right before her patent applications were approved. Those patents, by the way, somehow ended up filed under your name 6 months later. Claire's face had gone so pale, she looked like a vampire who'd been living on a diet of nothing but fear and regret. That's not. I never. Oh, but you did. I interrupted, clicking to show email screenshots that would have made a prosecutor weep with joy. I've got your emails, your bank records, even the receipts from the restaurant where you celebrated screwing over yet another colleague. You had the surf and turf, if I remember correctly. $90 lobster to celebrate destroying a woman's career. Classy. The directors around the table were looking at Claire like she'd just revealed herself to be the corporate equivalent of a serial killer. Which, in a way, she kind of was. Instead of bodies, she left behind ruined careers and stolen dreams. But the principle was the same. I clicked to the next name, Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, a computer engineer who'd been developing quantum encryption algorithms. Claire had sabotaged his lab equipment and then blamed the resulting data loss on his incompetence. She'd gotten him blacklisted from the entire tech industry while quietly stealing his research and selling it to defense contractors. Marcus Rodriguez. I continued my little presentation of horrors. Remember him? The guy whose lab mysteriously suffered that equipment malfunction that destroyed 6 months of research? Funny thing about security cameras, they see everything, even when people think they're being sneaky. The slide showed grainy but clear footage of Claire sneaking into Rodriguez's lab at 2 in the morning, systematically destroying equipment and wiping servers. She was wearing all black like some kind of corporate ninja, but her distinctive walk and that ridiculous designer handbag gave her away immediately. You bitch, whispered one of the directors, a gray-haired woman named Patricia who'd apparently worked with Rodriguez. Marcus was brilliant. He had 3 kids to feed, and you destroyed him for what? A few million in stolen patents. Claire was openly crying now, mascara running down her cheeks like black tears. But I wasn't feeling particularly sympathetic. This woman had spent years systematically destroying innocent people's lives to advance her own career, and now she was upset because she'd finally been caught? Please. The slideshow continued. Dr. James Park, whose revolutionary solar cell design Claire had stolen and buried because it would have made her own energy division obsolete. Dr. Lisa Washington, whose AI research Claire had sabotaged because she was afraid of being shown up by someone younger and smarter. Dr. Robert Kim, whose medical device innovations Claire had stolen and sold to pharmaceutical companies for kickbacks. The list went on, a parade of brilliant minds whose work had been stolen, whose careers had been ruined, whose innovations had been buried. Also that Claire could maintain her position as head of the innovation division without actually having to innovate anything herself. 12 researchers, I announced, letting the number sink in. 12 brilliant minds, representing probably 50 years of combined experience and research, all destroyed by one selfish, talentless parasite who couldn't stand the thought of actually earning her position. Henry was staring at his daughter like he was seeing her for the first time, and what he was seeing clearly horrified him. Claire, he whispered, his voice cracking like old leather. Tell me this isn't true. Tell me you didn't. She did, I said firmly. Every single bit of it. And here's the beautiful part. She documented everything herself. Emails bragging about her strategic personnel decisions. Text messages to her friends about eliminating the competition. Bank records showing payments from companies that mysteriously received stolen research data shortly after each firing. The board members were whispering among themselves, their voices rising in anger as they realized the full scope of what Claire had done. These people might have been corporate sharks, but they understood the difference between ruthless business practices and outright theft. What Claire had done wasn't just unethical, it was criminal. My phone buzzed again. Another message from my lawyer. FBI contacted. Formal investigation opening. Multiple felony charges likely. Oh, and Claire, I said, showing her my phone screen. The FBI is very interested in having a chat with you. Something about wire fraud, corporate espionage, and racketeering. Apparently, destroying people's careers while stealing their intellectual property is frowned upon by federal authorities. Who knew? Claire let out this weird, keening sound, like a wounded animal realizing it was trapped. You can't do this to me. I'm your wife. I'm family. Henry slammed his fist on the table so hard that everyone's coffee jumped. Family, he roared, his face turning that dangerous shade of purple that meant his blood pressure was approaching liftoff. You destroyed this company. You destroyed innocent people. You're a goddamn criminal. She's your daughter. I shot back, standing up and leaning across the table. This is the family you chose over integrity, over innovation, over doing what's right. This is what you get when you value profit over people and politics over progress. The security team I'd called earlier, because I'd learned to plan ahead, entered the boardroom right on cue. Two professional-looking guys in dark suits who moved with the kind of confidence that comes from years of dealing with corporate criminals. Ms. Thompson, one of them said politely, "We need you to come with us. You have the right to remain silent." As they read Claire her rights and escorted her out of the boardroom, she turned back to look at me with pure hatred in her eyes. "This isn't over," she hissed. "You'll pay for this." I smiled and waved goodbye. "No, sweetheart. You already paid. With interest." With Claire being perp walked out of the boardroom like some white-collar criminal from a Law and Order episode, you'd think the drama was over. But honestly, I was just getting warmed up. The best part about having spent 2 years planning this corporate coup wasn't the revenge. Though that was pretty damn satisfying, it was finally getting to reveal the ace I'd been hiding up my sleeve this entire time. "All right, everyone," I said, walking over to the wall panel that controlled the room's lighting and presentation systems. "Now that we've cleared out the trash, let's talk about why you're all going to want to keep your jobs and maybe even start taking me seriously for once." I dimmed the lights with theatrical flair that would have made Henry proud, if Henry hadn't been sitting there looking like someone had just told him Santa Claus was a registered sex offender. The massive wall screen flickered to life, and what appeared made everyone in that room stop breathing for about 5 seconds straight. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced with the kind of grin that probably made me look slightly psychotic, "I present to you Project Genesis." The screen showed architectural blueprints that looked like something out of a James Bond movie. Cross-sections, floor plans, and 3D renderings of what was clearly an underground facility that put NASA's mission control to shame. This wasn't some dingy basement lab with second-hand equipment and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like corpses. This was a full-scale, state-of-the-art research complex that stretched out like an underground city. The gasps from around the table were absolutely music to my ears. These people had spent so much time looking down on me that they'd never bothered to wonder what I was actually doing with my time. While they were playing corporate politics and stabbing each other in the back, I'd been building the future right under their noses. "What the hell is that?" Patricia whispered, leaning forward so far she almost fell out of her chair. Her reading glasses were practically steamed up as she tried to process what she was seeing. "That," I said with the satisfaction of a magician revealing his greatest trick, "is a fully operational quantum research facility located approximately 200 feet directly beneath my modest little lab across town. The one you all assumed was just me playing with chemistry sets and delusions of grandeur." Henry's mouth was hanging open so wide I could see his dental work. "That's impossible," he managed to croak. "Something that size, the permits alone would cost millions, the construction, the equipment." 3 football fields, I interrupted cheerfully. "That's how big it is. 3 full football fields of the most advanced quantum research equipment on the planet, staffed by some of the brightest minds in theoretical physics, computer science, and applied mathematics. You know, the kind of minds that Aldrich Dynamics has been systematically firing and blacklisting for the past 5 years." The next slide showed the funding breakdown, and I watched several board members' eyes bug out like cartoon characters. The numbers were staggering, not just because of the amount, but because of where the money had come from. Private investors who actually believed in innovation rather than quarterly profit margins. Tech billionaires who understood that sometimes you had to spend money to change the world. Government grants that I'd secured by actually proving my concepts worked instead of just promising they might work someday. Funded entirely through my grandmother's trust and a consortium of private investors. I continued, savoring every word. $67 million in initial investment, with an additional $40 million in equipment and staffing over the past 18 months. All completely independent of Aldridge Dynamics, all completely legal, and all completely mine. The third slide showed the construction timeline, with time-lapse photography that made the whole project look like some kind of engineering miracle. Crews working around the clock, massive equipment being lowered through specially constructed shafts, concrete being poured into forms that would make ancient Roman architects weep with envy. "How did you keep this secret?" asked Robert Chun, one of the younger board members who actually seemed impressed rather than just terrified. "Something this size, this many people involved. How did nobody notice?" "Compartmentalization," I explained, clicking to a slide that showed the project's organizational structure. Each construction crew only knew about their specific section. Equipment suppliers thought they were fulfilling orders for multiple smaller projects. The permits were filed under 17 different shell companies across 3 states. And most importantly, everyone involved signed NDAs with penalty clauses that would bankrupt small countries. But the real showstopper came when Dr. Sofia Ramirez stepped into the boardroom. I'd been wondering when she'd show up. We'd planned this entrance perfectly, timing it right after the construction reveal for maximum impact. Sophia walked in like she owned the place, which in a way, she kind of did. She was my head of research, my second in command, and the woman who'd helped turn my theoretical algorithms into working reality. The look on Henry's face when he saw her was absolutely priceless. Sophia had been one of Aldridge Dynamics' most promising physicists 3 years ago, right up until Claire had gotten her fired for insubordination. The real crime? Sophia had refused to let Claire steal her research on quantum field manipulation, and she'd made the mistake of documenting Claire's attempts at theft. "Hello, Henry," Sophia said with a smile that could cut glass. "Fancy seeing you here." Henry looked like he'd just seen a ghost, if ghosts wore lab coats and carried tablets full of world-changing research data. "Sophia, but we terminated. You illegally terminated me for refusing to participate in intellectual property theft," she corrected smoothly. "Fortunately, David here offered me a position where I could actually do science instead of playing corporate politics." Sophia walked over to the presentation screen and pulled up a new set of slides that made everyone's previous gasps sound like whispers. Technical diagrams, test results, and performance metrics that looked like science fiction made real. "With David's quantum stability algorithm," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 3 years proving the impossible, "we've created the world's first stable, room-temperature quantum computer. Not a prototype that works for 30 seconds under ideal laboratory conditions. Not a proof of concept that might work someday, if we're lucky. A fully functional quantum processing unit that fits in a laptop case and operates at normal atmospheric pressure and temperature." The silence that followed was the kind you hear right before a nuclear explosion. These people were looking at technology that would make current computers look like stone tools, processing power that could solve problems in minutes that would take traditional supercomputers decades to crack. My phone buzzed again. Another message from the patent office. Current bidding at $7.2 billion. Department of Defense requesting immediate consultation. Chinese delegation offering state-level negotiations. $7.2 billion. The number was so big it didn't even feel real anymore. We were talking about enough. Money to fund entire countries' annual budgets, to solve global problems, to literally change the world. "The prototype is ready," Sophia continued, and I swear I could hear the stock market having a collective heart attack from 30 floors up. "We've successfully demonstrated stable quantum entanglement, perfect error correction, and processing speeds that exceed our wildest projections. We're not just ahead of the competition. We've lapped them so many times they can't even see our dust." I looked around the boardroom at all these people who'd spent years treating me like an inconvenient relative who couldn't take a hint. Henry, who'd dismissed my work as science fiction. The board members who'd rolled their eyes every time I tried to explain quantum mechanics. The executives who'd made jokes about my fantasy projects behind my back. Now they were all staring at me like I'd just pulled the Hope Diamond out of my ass and announced I was opening a jewelry store. "Questions?" I asked innocently. Henry's face went through more color changes than a chameleon having an identity crisis. First red, then white, Then this sickly green shade that reminded me of expired guacamole. He was gripping the edge of the conference table so hard his knuckles had gone bone white, and I could practically see the gears grinding in his head as he tried to process the magnitude of what he'd just learned. Those scientists, Henry finally managed to stammer, his voice cracking like a 13-year-old boy asking someone to prom. They were terminated. Fired. Gone. We made sure they could never work in this industry again. See, that's where you're wrong again, Hank, I said, using that nickname that made his eye twitch like he'd been electrocuted. You didn't fire them. You illegally terminated them. There's a pretty significant legal difference between the two, and my lawyers have been documenting every single wrongful termination case for the past 3 years. I clicked to the next slide, which showed an organizational chart that looked like a who's who of scientific brilliance. Every name on that chart was someone who'd been screwed over by Aldrich Dynamics, someone whose career had been derailed by corporate politics and Claire's systematic sabotage campaigns. Dr. James Park, your former head of renewable energy research, I announced, pointing to the first name on the list. Fired for budget reasons right after he developed solar cells with 93% efficiency. He's now my director of sustainable technology, and his patents are worth about $800 million. Henry's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. He remembered James, all right. The man had been one of their most promising researchers until Claire had convinced Henry that he was too expensive and not a team player. The real reason? James had refused to sign over his patent rights to the company. Dr. Lisa Washington, I continued, enjoying the way Henry flinched at each name. Terminated for performance issues after she developed AI algorithms that could predict market trends with unprecedented accuracy. She's now running my financial modeling department, and her work is why I knew exactly when to file my patents for maximum impact. The slide showed Lisa's breakthrough research, algorithms so sophisticated they made Wall Street's best prediction models look like magic 8 balls. She tried to present her work to the Aldrich board 2 years ago, but Claire had sabotaged the presentation by accidentally corrupting the data files right before the meeting. Dr. Robert Kim, I went on, my voice getting stronger with each revelation. Fired for restructuring reasons after he developed medical devices that could detect cancer cells with 98% accuracy using nothing but a smartphone camera. He's now my head of biomedical research, and his work is going to save about 1 million lives per year. Each name I read was like another nail in Henry's coffin. These weren't just random employees who'd been let go during budget cuts. These were the best and brightest minds in their respective fields, and Henry had thrown them all away because his daughter was too insecure to work alongside people who were smarter than her. The people you discarded, I said, my voice taking on an edge that could have cut through steel. The researchers you blacklisted, the innovators you destroyed, they're all working for me now. Every single brilliant mind that Aldrich Dynamics threw away like garbage is now part of something bigger, something better, something that's going to make your little corporate empire look like a lemonade stand. Henry was shaking now, and not just his hands. His whole body was trembling like a leaf in a hurricane as the full magnitude of his mistakes hit him. All those terminations he'd signed off on, all those careers he'd destroyed at Claire's urging, all those innovations he'd buried, they were all coming back to haunt him. But I wasn't done yet. Not even close. I pulled out a manila folder that had been sitting in my briefcase like a loaded gun, waiting for this exact moment. The folder was thick, stuffed with documents that represented months of careful investigation and legal preparation. I slid it across the table to Henry with the kind of casual gesture you'd use to pass the salt. Your retirement package, I announced cheerfully. I'd suggest you read through it carefully and sign it before the SEC and FBI finish their investigations. Henry's hands shook as he opened the folder, and I watched his face go from green to gray as he read through the contents. Inside were termination papers, pension documents, and a very detailed list of all the illegal activities that had been happening under his watch. Corporate espionage, patent theft, wrongful termination, securities fraud. The list went on for pages. This is extortion, Henry whispered, but there was no conviction in his voice. He knew he was fucked, and he knew I had him dead to rights. No, Henry, I corrected gently. This is consequences. You spent 20 years building an empire based on intimidation, theft, and the systematic destruction of anyone who threatened your position. You created a corporate culture where innovation was punished and conformity was rewarded. You let your daughter turn the company into her personal piggy bank while she destroyed careers for fun. This is just the bill coming due. The board members were looking back and forth between Henry and me like they were watching the world's most expensive tennis match. I could practically see them calculating their own survival odds, wondering which side of this corporate war they needed to be on to keep their jobs. My phone buzzed again, and I glanced down to see another message that made me smile. The stock price was going absolutely insane. Aldrich Dynamics stock was climbing so fast the trading algorithms couldn't keep up. We were looking at the biggest single-day gain in the company's history, and it was all because the market had figured out that the quiet son-in-law everyone had been ignoring was actually a genius. 8.3 billion now, I announced casually, showing my phone to the room. Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Apple, and Tesla are all in a bidding war for exclusive licensing rights. The Pentagon is offering a blank check for military applications. China just called offering to trade 3 provinces and their national debt for the technology. Henry looked like he might actually pass out. The man who'd built his entire identity around being the smartest guy in the room was realizing that he'd been played by someone he'd never even bothered to take seriously. The board of directors, I continued, standing up and walking around the table like a predator circling wounded prey, has exactly 30 seconds to decide whether they want to be part of the new Aldrich Dynamics or if they'd prefer to update their resumes. Because in about 5 minutes, I'm going to be sitting in that chair. I pointed to Henry's seat at the head of the table, and anyone who's not on board with the new direction can clean out their offices. I looked around the room, meeting each person's eyes. These people had spent years treating me like furniture, ignoring my ideas, dismissing my contributions, and generally acting like I was some kind of charity case that Claire had dragged in off the street. Now they were all staring at me with the kind of respect that only comes from absolute terror and the sudden realization that their entire future depended on staying in my good graces. All in favor of the new management structure, I said, raising my hand. Say aye. The chorus of aye that followed was so unanimous you'd have thought they were voting on free pizza for everyone. 1 month later, walking through the Aldrich Dynamics headquarters felt like stepping into a completely different universe. Gone was the oppressive corporate atmosphere where innovation went to die and ass-kissing was considered a core competency. The place was buzzing with actual energy now, the kind of electricity you feel when brilliant minds are finally free to do what they do best without some trust fund princess sabotaging their work every 5 minutes. The first thing I'd done after officially taking over was tear down Henry's ridiculous executive fortress on the top floor. That pretentious corner office with its marble floors, imported leather furniture, and walls lined with awards for business excellence got gutted faster than a fish at a sushi restaurant. In its place, we'd built something that would have given the old Henry a heart attack. Transparent laboratory spaces where anyone could see the actual work being done. No more closed-door meetings where careers went to die. No more secret handshakes and golf course deals that determined who got funding and who got fired. Everything was out in the open now, because when you're actually doing groundbreaking science instead of playing corporate politics, transparency becomes your best friend rather than your worst enemy. Dr. Sofia Ramirez had transformed the entire 15th floor into what looked like mission control for launching rockets to Mars. Banks of quantum computers hummed quietly in climate-controlled chambers, their processing power so intense they could solve mathematical problems that would have taken traditional supercomputers until the heat death of the universe. The walls were covered with white boards filled with equations that looked like someone had taken calculus and beaten it to death with theoretical physics. How are the climate simulations coming along? I asked Sophia as I walked through her domain, watching her team of formerly blacklisted scientists work their magic. We solved the Pacific Ocean temperature modeling problem yesterday, she said with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather instead of announcing a breakthrough that climate scientists had been struggling with for decades. Turns out when you have quantum processing power that doesn't choke on massive datasets, you can predict weather patterns 6 months out with 97% accuracy. 6 months. The best meteorologists in the world struggled to predict weather accurately beyond 5 days, and my team had just extended that timeline by a factor of 36. The implications were staggering: crop planning, disaster preparedness, energy grid management, shipping routes. We were looking at technology that could prevent famines and save thousands of lives from natural disasters. Down on the 12th floor, Dr. James Park had turned what used to be Claire's innovation division. And I use that term loosely since the only thing she'd ever innovated was new ways to steal other people's work into a renewable energy research paradise. Solar panels that looked like they belonged on alien spacecraft covered every available surface, feeding power back into the building's grid and making our monthly electric bills look like pocket change. The protein folding breakthrough is working better than we projected, James called out as I walked through his lab. He was standing in front of a holographic display that showed molecular structures rotating in three-dimensional space, their bonds and interactions mapped out in real time by our quantum computers. We're looking at drug development timelines that are about 50 times faster than current industry standards. 50 times faster. The pharmaceutical industry typically took 15 years and billions of dollars to develop new medications. We were talking about reducing that to months instead of decades, turning drug discovery from a slow-motion marathon into a sprint. Cancer treatments, Alzheimer's research, rare disease cures, all suddenly within reach instead of perpetually 5 years away, like they'd been for the past 50 years. The best part wasn't just the scientific breakthroughs, though those were pretty damn spectacular. The best part was watching the people who'd been crushed by Henry and Claire's regime come back to life. Scientists who'd been working dead-end jobs at community colleges were now leading research teams that were literally changing the world. Researchers who'd been blacklisted from the industry were publishing papers that were getting cited thousands of times before the ink was even dry. Dr. Lisa Washington had taken over the 8th floor and turned it into what looked like the world's most sophisticated financial war room. Her AI algorithms were running continuously, analyzing market trends, predicting economic shifts, and managing investment portfolios with success rates that made Wall Street's best hedge fund managers look like children playing with monopoly money. The encryption systems are making banks nervous, Lisa mentioned as I stopped by her workstation. We've created quantum encryption that's literally mathematically impossible to break using any known computational methods. The NSA called twice today asking if we're planning to share with friendly governments or if they need to start planning for a world where their current surveillance methods are obsolete. The irony wasn't lost on me. A month ago, these same government agencies had been perfectly happy to let Aldridge Dynamics stagnate under Henry's leadership, probably figuring that American technological superiority was safe as long as we kept throwing money at the same old approaches. Now they were scrambling to understand how a company they'd written off had suddenly leapfrogged decades ahead of everyone else. My phone buzzed constantly with requests from reporters, government officials, foreign delegations, and corporate executives who all wanted to understand how the hell we'd pulled off this transformation. The bidding war for our quantum computing patents had reached $12 billion and was still climbing. Tech companies that had been dismissing quantum computing as 10 years away were now offering to buy entire divisions just to get access to our research. But the most satisfying calls were from Claire's former victims. The researchers she'd destroyed, the innovators she'd buried, the brilliant minds she'd driven out of the industry. Dr. Sarah Chun had called to thank me personally for clearing her name and restoring her reputation. Dr. Marcus Rodriguez was collaborating with our security division to develop quantum encrypted communication systems. Dr. Robert Kim was working with our biomedical team to integrate his cancer detection technology with our processing power. Every single person whose career Claire had destroyed was now thriving, their work finally getting the recognition and resources it deserved. Meanwhile, Claire herself was sitting in a federal detention center awaiting trial on enough felony charges to keep her busy for the next couple of decades. Henry had quietly signed his retirement papers and disappeared to his beach house in the Hamptons, probably spending his days drinking expensive scotch and wondering how the quiet son-in-law he'd dismissed as worthless had managed to outplay him so completely. The man who'd built his identity around being the smartest guy in the room had been checkmated by someone he'd never bothered to take seriously. The revolution wasn't just technological, it was cultural. Instead of a corporate hierarchy built on fear and intimidation, We'd created a collaborative environment where the best ideas won regardless of who thought of them. Instead of quarterly profit reports that prioritized short-term gains over long-term innovation, we were focused on solving problems that would matter 50 years from now. And for the first time in my adult life, I walked through those office hallways knowing that I wasn't the overlooked husband, the dismissed son-in-law, or the quiet guy everyone ignored. I was the man who'd taken a dying company and transformed it into something that would change the world. I was reviewing quarterly projections in my office, Henry's former throne room that I converted into something that actually resembled a workspace instead of a shrine to corporate ego, when my secretary buzzed in with news that made me damn near spit coffee all over my computer screen. "Sir, Margaret Aldridge is here to see you," she said through the intercom, her voice carrying that special tone people use when they're delivering news that's somewhere between surprising and potentially apocalyptic. Margaret, Claire's mother, Henry's wife, the woman who'd perfected the art of looking down her nose at people from such great heights that she could probably see their dandruff from orbit. In all the years I'd been married to her daughter, Margaret had spoken to me exactly 14 times, and most of those conversations had consisted of her asking me to fetch her coat or move my car because it was cluttering up the circular drive. "Send her in," I said, curious as hell about what could possibly bring the Queen of Aldridge Dynasty social climbing to my office. The last time I'd seen Margaret, she'd been at Claire's arraignment, sitting in the gallery looking like someone had just told her that caviar was actually fish eggs, and poor people had been eating it for centuries. The woman who walked through my office door was not the Margaret Aldridge I remembered. Gone were the designer suits that cost more than most people's cars, the pearl necklaces that could probably fund a small country's education budget, and that perfectly coiffed hair that looked like it had been styled by angels who charged by the hour. Instead, she was wearing a simple navy blazer that looked like it came from an actual store where normal humans shop, and her hair was, well, it looked like hair. Just regular, human hair that hadn't been sculpted into submission by a team of professionals. But it was her eyes that really threw me. Margaret Aldridge had always looked at the world with the supreme confidence of someone who'd never been wrong about anything in her entire privileged life. Now she looked tired, older, and for the first time since I'd known her, genuinely uncertain about something. "David," she said simply, and even her voice was different. No condescension, no barely concealed disgust, no tone that suggested she was doing me a tremendous favor by acknowledging my existence. Just weariness. "Margaret," I replied, gesturing to one of the chairs across from my desk. "This is unexpected." She sat down carefully, like someone who'd recently discovered that the world was more fragile than she'd previously believed. For a long moment, we just looked at each other across the desk where her husband had once held court like some kind of corporate emperor. "We dismissed you," she said finally, her voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear her properly. "All of us. From the very beginning, we dismissed everything about you. Your work, your ideas, your potential. We treated you like—" She paused, searching for the right words. "Like you were some kind of charity case that Claire had dragged home out of misplaced sympathy." I didn't say anything. What was there to say? She was absolutely right, and we both knew it. "We were wrong," she continued, and those 3 words carried more weight than anything she'd ever said to me before. Catastrophically, completely, inexcusably wrong. Margaret reached into her purse, a simple black leather bag that probably cost less than what she used to spend on lunch, and pulled out a manila folder that looked like it had seen better days. She placed it on my desk with the careful reverence someone might use when handling historical documents. "I found this in Henry's study when I was cleaning out his papers," she said, hidden in the back of his filing cabinet, behind his golf tournament trophies. I opened the folder, and what I saw inside made my chest tighten with emotions I hadn't expected. Photocopies of my early sketches, equations I'd scrawled on napkins during family dinners, research notes I'd shared with Henry years ago when I'd still been naive enough to think he might actually listen. Page after page of my work, carefully organized and preserved, dating back almost to the beginning of my marriage to Claire. "Even then," Margaret said, her voice starting to tremble, "even in those early days when you were just starting to develop your theories, you were trying to show us. You brought Henry those equations, remember? You tried to explain your ideas about quantum stability during Christmas dinner 3 years ago. You were so excited, so passionate about the possibilities. I remembered. God, how could I forget? I'd been like a kid showing off a science fair project, genuinely believing that my father-in-law might be interested in what I was working on. Instead, Henry had barely glanced at my notes before dismissing them as theoretical nonsense and changing the subject to stock prices. We didn't listen, Margaret continued, and now there were actual tears in her eyes. Tears. From a woman I'd never seen display any emotion stronger than mild annoyance at the help bringing the wrong vintage of wine. We were so convinced that we knew better, that our way of doing business was the only way that mattered. We couldn't see past our own arrogance long enough to recognize genius when it was sitting at our dinner table. She reached across the desk and touched the folder gently, like it was something precious that might crumble if handled too roughly. You could have changed everything, David. If we'd just listened, if we'd just given you the support and resources you needed instead of treating you like an inconvenience. Imagine what we could have accomplished together. The irony was almost too bitter to swallow. Here I was, sitting in Henry's chair, running the company he'd built, commanding the respect he'd always craved. And his wife was finally acknowledging that the son-in-law they'd dismissed as worthless had been the key to everything they'd claimed to want. Why are you telling me this? I asked quietly. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands like they held answers to questions she was still learning how to ask. Because I need you to know that not all of us were blind by choice. Henry was so invested in being right about everything that he couldn't admit when he was wrong. And Claire. Her voice broke slightly. Claire was so threatened by anyone who might outshine her that she turned sabotage into an art form. She looked up at me then, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before, genuine remorse. But I should have known better, she said firmly. I should have seen what you were capable of. I should have stood up to Henry when he dismissed your work. I should have protected you from Claire's machinations. I should have been the mother-in-law you deserved instead of the one you got stuck with. I felt something inside my chest loosen, a knot of resentment I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. This wasn't the apology I'd expected to receive, mainly because I'd never expected to receive one at all. What do you want, Margaret? I asked, not unkindly. She straightened up slightly, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of the formidable woman she'd always been, just pointed in a different direction now. I want to help, she said simply. I want to make amends. I want to take my father's charitable foundation, the one that's been funding country club renovations and society galas for the past 20 years, and turn it into something that actually matters. I want to fund young innovators, support researchers who are getting dismissed by people like we used to be, give brilliant minds the resources they need to change the world. She leaned forward earnestly. I want to make sure that the next David Thompson doesn't have to wait 10 years and stage a corporate revolution just to get someone to take his ideas seriously. And for the first time since this whole saga began, I found myself genuinely surprised by a member of the Aldrich family. 3 months later, the boardroom that had once been the site of my corporate execution had transformed into something that looked like mission control for launching humanity into the next century. The same mahogany table where Henry had tried to flush my life's work down the toilet was now surrounded by scientists, researchers, and government officials who were practically vibrating with excitement over breakthroughs that were happening faster than we could document them. The morning briefings had become the highlight of my day, mainly because every single report sounded like science fiction that had decided to become reality just to prove the skeptics wrong. Today was no different, except that the numbers were so ridiculous they'd stopped feeling like real money and started feeling like high scores in some cosmic video game. Cancer trials are showing success rates we've never seen before, Dr. Sofia Ramirez announced, pulling up holographic displays that made the room look like the bridge of a starship. The quantum-enhanced targeting system can identify and eliminate malignant cells with 98.7% accuracy while leaving healthy tissue completely untouched. 98.7%. Traditional chemotherapy had success rates that made coin flips look like sure bets, and we'd essentially turned cancer treatment into a precision surgical strike. The implications were staggering. Millions of lives saved, families that wouldn't have to watch their loved ones waste away, children who'd grow up with grandparents instead of just photographs. How soon before we can start human trials? Asked Dr. Patricia Wong, our new head of medical ethics. Patricia was one of those people who'd been blacklisted from the industry for having the audacity to suggest that maybe, just maybe, medical research should prioritize saving lives over maximizing profits. FDA fast-tracked approval came through yesterday. Sophia replied with the kind of grin that could power small cities. First patients start treatment next Monday. Next Monday. We were talking about technology that would revolutionize medicine, and it was happening next Monday. Not in 5 years, not after decades of additional research, not, maybe someday, if we're lucky. Next goddamn Monday. But the cancer breakthrough was just the appetizer. The main course came when Dr. James Park stood up to deliver his report on what he was calling Project Lazarus, our carbon capture and climate reversal initiative. The atmospheric processing models are working better than our most optimistic projections, James announced, his voice carrying the excitement of someone who'd just figured out how to save the world. The quantum-enhanced molecular manipulation can extract carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and convert it into useful materials at a rate that would reverse global warming within 15 years. 15 years. Climate scientists had been saying we had maybe 50 years to prevent catastrophic global warming, and James had just casually announced that we could reverse it in less than 2 decades. The technology was so efficient it could literally suck greenhouse gases out of the air and turn them into building materials, creating an economy based on cleaning up the planet instead of destroying it. My phone, which had become less of a communication device and more of a continuous stream of increasingly absurd offers, buzzed with another notification that made me laugh out loud. The European Union was offering to trade their entire renewable energy grid for exclusive licensing rights. China had called offering to make me an honorary citizen and throw in a few provinces for good measure. The UAE wanted to buy the entire company for what they called a number with many zeros. But the call that really got my attention came from NASA. They want to discuss something they're calling Project Starshot, my secretary had mentioned during the morning briefing. Something about quantum propulsion systems and getting to Mars in 6 weeks instead of 6 months. 6 weeks to Mars. The same journey that currently took the better part of a year, we could potentially do in the time it takes to get really good at a new hobby. Space exploration had just gone from a slow crawl to a sprint, and apparently we were the ones holding the starting gun. The really delicious part wasn't just the scientific breakthroughs, though. The really satisfying part was watching the corporate vultures who'd been circling our patent portfolio realize that we weren't playing the same game they were used to. Google is offering $18 billion for exclusive licensing, announced Marcus, my lawyer, reading from a tablet that looked like it was about to catch fire from all the incoming offers. Microsoft wanted $22 billion. Apple just submitted what they're calling a blank check with a smiley face drawn on it. $22 billion. With AB, we were talking about enough money to fund small countries, solve global hunger, or buy Twitter and turn it into something useful. But every single offer got the same response from me. Not interested, I said, leaning back in Henry's old chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd just won a game that most people didn't even know they were playing. We don't sell revolutions. We lead them. The looks of confusion from some of the newer board members were priceless. These were people who'd spent their entire careers thinking in terms of quarterly profits and shareholder value, and they couldn't comprehend turning down billions of dollars just because it wasn't enough money. But sir, stammered Robert Chun, one of the directors who was still adjusting to the new reality, $18 billion is more money than most corporations will see in their entire existence. Robert, I said patiently, our quantum computing patents alone are worth more than the gross domestic product of most nations. The cancer treatment technology could generate trillions in revenue over the next decade. The climate reversal system is literally priceless because you can't put a price tag on saving the planet. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline where construction cranes were working around the clock to build the manufacturing facilities we'd need to scale up production. We're not just sitting on the next generation of technology. We're sitting on the next evolution of human civilization. And you want to sell that for what amounts to pocket change. The stock price was breaking records daily, climbing so fast that trading had to be halted twice just to let the computers catch up with the numbers. Financial analysts were running out of superlatives to describe what was happening. The phrase unprecedented growth had been used so often it had lost all meaning. But the sweetest moment came when the news broke about Claire's plea bargain. Your ex-wife officially pled guilty to 17 felony counts. Marcus mentioned casually, like he was discussing the weather. Wire fraud, corporate espionage, racketeering, and conspiracy. She's looking at 25 years minimum, and the judge denied bail pending sentencing. 25 years. The woman who'd spent our entire marriage undermining my work and planning my professional assassination was going to spend the next quarter century making license plates and learning why orange really wasn't her color. Henry, meanwhile, had become a cautionary tale told in business schools about the dangers of letting ego override judgment. The man who'd built his identity around being the smartest guy in the room had been completely outmaneuvered by the son-in-law he'd dismissed as worthless. As I looked around that boardroom at all the brilliant minds who'd been cast aside by the old regime, all the innovations that had been buried by corporate politics, all the world-changing technology that was finally getting the resources it deserved, I realized something important. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This had become something bigger, something that would outlast all of us and change the trajectory of human history. Standing in what used to be Henry's office, now mine, I stared out at the city skyline that had become a monument to second chances and vindicated dreams. The morning sun caught the glass facades of the new research facilities we'd built, each one representing another breakthrough that had started as a dismissed idea in some corporate boardroom where innovation went to die. On the wall behind my desk hung a sight that would have given Henry a stroke, my patents displayed right next to the original Aldrich Company charter, side by side like old friends who'd finally found their way home. The quantum stability algorithm that had started this whole revolution was framed in simple black, nothing fancy or pretentious, just the mathematical proof that sometimes the quiet guy in the corner is the one who's going to change everything. My phone buzzed with another message from the lab. Clinical trials approved for Alzheimer's treatment. First patients ready for quantum-enhanced neural repair. I smiled, remembering all those family dinners where Henry had dismissed my work as playing with equations, while his wife nodded along like a bobblehead in a hurricane. The directors who used to roll their eyes when I spoke now stood up when I entered the room, not out of fear, but out of genuine respect for someone who'd proven that crazy ideas sometimes turn out to be brilliant ones. The wife who'd mocked my fantasy projects was now sitting in a federal prison, probably wondering how the hell her meal ticket had turned into her worst nightmare. The father-in-law who'd called my life's work worthless nonsense had faded into obscurity, forgotten by an industry that had moved light years beyond his limited imagination. And me? The quiet, underestimated husband who'd spent years being treated like an inconvenience at his own family gatherings was now leading a technological revolution that would reshape human civilization. Because sometimes the people they laugh at the loudest, dismiss the quickest, and underestimate the most completely are the ones who end up rewriting the future while everyone else is still trying to figure out what the hell just happened.